Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Andrew Kaufman, and this is November 19th, 2020, and I'm coming to you with a special report today because yesterday, finally, the famous or infamous Danish mask study was published in the Annals of Internal Medicine. And this is a study, I'm going to share my screen with you right now, that has been prohibited from publication, as you can see here. So we have this article from the Blaze, but it basically is reporting what's in a Danish newspaper, which I've heard about from multiple sources, which is that they did a study on masks. Now, why is this so important? The reason is because while there are a lot of mask studies looking at the flu or colds or other issues, there are no real-world mask studies so far looking at COVID-19. This is the first one. The other studies that have been published are very speculative or observational. In other words, they are looking at what happened after the fact, and there's lots of conflicting data in the record in terms of epidemiology. You may have seen some recent presentations that highlighted that. So this is the first high quality study. It's a randomized controlled trial where it's designed in advance, and they have one group wear masks and the other group not wear masks, and they look at the infection rate. So this will be the most powerful scientific study that will be yet available to guide these masks policies. And so this paper, surprisingly, was rejected by three major journals, the New England Journal of Medicine, the Lancet, and the JAMA, which is the Journal of the American Medical Association. Now, this is quite surprising because, as you know, right now, everyone is wanting to publish any paper about COVID-19. And I've criticized a lot of these papers as being of poor quality. Yet they still get published in major journals like even Nature, as well as the New England Journal of Medicine. So this was quite surprising and made me think, well, what did they find that is unfavorable and a reason to block publication? So before I get into the study, I just want to point out, sorry, right here, if I can share something different. There we go. Sorry, I'm not more. Oh, I think I lost it. But anyway, what I wanted to mention was Denny Rancourt's paper that he did in the spring, which reviewed all of the mask studies. And there were quite a number of randomized controlled trials of masks, both N95 masks and surgical masks. And they were conducted both in healthcare workers as well as in people in the community. And they were looking at transmission of influenza and colds. And none of those studies found that the masks prevented any transmission of infection or reduced the incidence of infection. So that is what the background research shows. And now we have the first of these trials done for COVID-19 and the alleged SARS-CoV-2 virus. So here you can see this is the article from Annals of Internal Medicine, effectiveness of adding a mask recommendation to other public health measures to prevent SARS-CoV-2 infection in Danish mask wearers. Now, before we delve into this article, and I'm going to go through it with you in detail, I want to say that it's pretty evident that the authors changed their language in how they describe their findings and conclusions in this paper, because you can see that they're making it sound or try to sound like masks could be still helpful when this study actually does not provide any evidence of that whatsoever. So as we go through, I'll point out some of these issues. And if we just start right here at the abstract, which is like a brief summary of the article, and this is a convention to do with scientific articles, we can see that the objective here is to assess whether recommending surgical mask use outside the home reduces wearers' risk for SARS-CoV-2 infection in a setting where masks were uncommon and not recommended, not among recommended health measures. So this was done in Denmark, where at the time of the study, which was last April and May, they were not recommending masks to the general public. So the people in the study may have been among the few that were wearing masks in Denmark. So we'll skip ahead here to, we're going to review the results as we go through the paper. So I'm going to go to the body of the paper, but I want to point out that there are actually three different hypotheses here that could be shown by this paper. So two of them are kind of obvious, and one is present in all studies. So one would be that masks could show that they decreased the infection rate. The second would be that masks increase the infection rate, and it would be one or the other because those are opposite of each other. And then also the null hypothesis, which means there would be no relationship at all between mask wearing and infection rate. So we can see basically what they found here. So we go down a little bit. Now in the introduction section, they, of course, do make the assumption that SARS-CoV-2 causes this respiratory infection of COVID, but we know that that has not been proven, although many studies mention it. And they actually point to the World Health Organization as the source who had determined that. But if we look at the trial design, basically, they're looking, they have a, sorry, let's see where I wanted to go there. Sorry, it's really hard to scroll up and down on this very easily. But in any case, so here is where it describes the study. And there is a, sorry if I can see, a table I want to get to. Here we go. Okay, so let's see if we could bring this up. Great. And I'll move myself out of the way a little bit here. Okay, so this is how they recruited the study. So they had people who were interested in enrolling in the study and completed the form, and there were 17,000 of those. And then they had eligibility criteria like they had to actually fill out the form, for example, or they couldn't already have a positive test for one of the COVID-related tests. And so out of those that were included, they randomly assigned them either to the face mask group, and there were just over 3,000 people there, or the control group where they were not recommended to wear face masks. Now, what they did is that some of these people were lost during the study, and it was a 1 month or I believe 30 days of observation. And you see it went from 3,030 down to about 2,400 and from 3,000 down to about 2,500. And these boxes on the side are what happened that people dropped out of the study. So you can see a few of them just didn't follow the instructions properly. Some of them had positive results on the antibody test at the beginning of the study, so they didn't include those. And then basically people just didn't follow through for the most part. And it's almost the same on the face mask group. So we had here, this is how many had antibody data. And then here is how many had data on at the end. So basically everyone who made it to this study, they had data. And some of them had antibody tests, some of them had PCR tests. And then some of them actually received a diagnosis from a healthcare provider. Okay, so let's see if we can get back out of that. And so basically what they did is they had the two groups, the mask group and the non-mask group, and they did an initial test, and then they did a test at the end of the month. And they saw how many people went from a negative test to a positive test, and they could have a positive test by 3 different ways. It could be a positive PCR test, a positive antibody test, or they could be diagnosed by a healthcare professional. Okay, now you could see that they looked at a lot of different characteristics of the group, and they were pretty similar between both groups and other important factors for health. And then here, this is quite interesting because so in the mask group where they recommended it, they asked how many people actually wore it as recommended and how many didn't. And 93% actually wore it as recommended, at least predominantly. and only 7% did not do it as recommended. And this is important because when they looked at the outcomes, they looked at the group as a whole, and then they discounted the people that didn't take it seriously or wear it as directed. And so we could see the outcomes based on those different group analyses. And here is basically the beginning of the results. And you could see that in the mask group, there were 42 people who converted to a positive test. Sorry, in the mask group, and then there are 53 in the control group. Now remember, the control group was a little bit larger. And these worked out to be 1.8% and 2.1%. So you could see that those really are both pretty much the same number, 2%. There's no big difference. But they did a statistical analysis to make sure that there really was no difference. And that's what you see with all these numbers here. So what they say here in an intention to treat analysis, and that means that anyone who intended to be in the end was counted in the data, even if they dropped out early. The difference between groups was minus 0.3 percentage point. Okay, and that's just 2.1, or sorry, it's 1.8 minus 2.1. That's get minus 3. So this minus means that it had less infection. Now the confidence interval, which is 95% of the data points, goes from minus 1.2 to positive 0.4. Now what this means is since it crosses 0, it goes in both the negative and the positive direction. It means that it is insignificant, okay? Because the masks can't both reduce and increase infections. So this means we can kind of throw out this difference and say there's really no difference between these two groups. Now that also plays out when we look at this p-value, and that means the probability that this result occurred by random chance. And you can see that it's 0.38, which is 38%. So that means that we can't trust this result at all. And the odds ratio, right, which is basically your odds of getting an infection if you wear a mask, is 0.82. But we look again at the confidence interval and it crosses 1, and 1 means no difference. So less than 1, this 0.54 means it reduces infection, and this 1.23 means it increases infection. So once again, we can throw out all these numbers as meaningless, and the probability here, once again, 33% that the result occurred by chance. The convention in medical science is that the probability should be less than 0.05 in order to be considered significant, which means less than a 5% chance that the result occurred by random chance. So here we see that we don't have any statistical significance, and what that means is there's no difference between these two groups. So wearing a mask or no mask doesn't make any difference whether you have an infection or not. So pretty cut and dry. But now they actually did the analysis a couple of other ways, because remember I told you that 7% of the people didn't really wear the mask properly. So what they did is they took those 7% of people out of the equation totally and then redid the math. And what do they find again? So here it's minus 0.4, slightly different than 0.3. But once again, confidence interval crosses 0. And the p-value is not significant. Odd ratio, same thing, it crosses 1, p-value is not significant. So I think they did one more analysis where they removed anybody who, unless they perfectly wore the mask, and once again, the results were same. There was no significant difference between the two groups. So those are the main things that they had planned to do and did, but then they did what they call a post hoc analysis, which means after they had the results, they decided to do this kind of analysis. And so this is where they did the experiment I just mentioned, where they only included people wearing it exactly as instructed. And once again, you can see actually less of magnitude of difference, but it doesn't matter because it crosses 0. The p-value is not significant. Odds ratio crosses 1, second thing. Okay, so in other words, no matter which way they analyzed this data, they got the same exact results the null hypothesis. There is no relationship shown between masks and infection. And this study was actually very well designed and very well powered to assess this outcome, because they basically planned it so that about 2% of the population would have a positive test, and that's exactly what they got. So everything was done really well with this study. So we're going to skip the secondary outcome because that's just tests for other viruses, and it wasn't very significant. They didn't find other viruses in people. But I want to just point out the discussion, because this is where they really hedge the language. And it's important to see this in action, because it's really significant. But you can still find out what they're trying to say. So here we go. This is the discussion section. In this community-based randomized controlled trial conducted in a setting where mask wearing was uncommon and was not among other recommended public health measures related to COVID-19. Okay, so in other words, in a place with no masks, a recommendation to wear a surgical mask when outside the home, among others, did not reduce at conventional levels of statistical significance. In fact, nowhere near close to conventional levels. Incident SARS-CoV-2 infection compared with no mask recommendation. Now, they hedged it by saying a recommendation to wear a mask, but in the analysis, they actually just looked at the group, the part of that group that actually followed the recommendation to the letter, and there was still no reduction in incident infection. So did not reduce incident SARS-CoV-2 infection. That is the key takeaway, the only thing really that it should say in this discussion section. But I want to point out one other thing, because this would never, I've never seen anything like this reported in a paper. It really defies mathematics to discuss it this way, because the findings are not significant. So you can't interpret them as real. The only thing you can say is that there's no relationship between masks and the infection. But look what they write here. They write that the 95% confidence intervals are compatible with a possible 46% reduction to 26 to 23% increase in infection among mask wearers. So they're telling you, well, it could both reduce and increase infection if you wear a mask. Now that is just quite silly to be included in there, but these are the kind of things that they have to say just in order to get published, because this is a very unpopular finding. So just to review, we have here the first randomized control trial, of actual high quality prospective trial, extremely well carried out, following all the general conventions of how to do this, including a simple but potent statistical analysis. And the results show that there is no significant relationship between mask wearing and SARS-CoV-2 infection by the PCR antibody test or clinical diagnosis. And most importantly, they show that the masks do not reduce the infection. Now, this is the highest quality, only real world study that we have to date related to COVID, and it has the same exact finding as every other randomized controlled trial that's been looked at in any viral illness. So I think it's safe to say that we can conclude masks do not work. Thank you very much for your time. Can't wait to see you soon.